Scripture.
So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from us, each one of us. In him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring." Word of the Lord.
Good morning. It's good to be here with all of you on this first Sunday of 2020. My name's Dwayne Smith, and it's my honor and a great opportunity for me to be here to speak with you and deliver the message this morning. You're welcome. Got a lot of good friends here, so. Now, for those of you who may not know me, my family and I have been attending Trinity here for about 15 years now. We joined a small group shortly after we came to the church, and we've been in that group since. In fact, I've had the opportunity to teach in that small group over time. I do a lot of ministry work here at Trinity. I'm on the Welcome and Connection group. You may have seen me in the front sometimes. Part of the counting ministry that counts tithes and offerings. Most recently started doing some work with the communion servers. By the way, these are all great opportunities to serve here at Trinity. So if you're interested, there's information in the bulletin about all of those. I also served on the trustee board here for about 9 years, chaired it for 7. And those of you who know me from that work may recall that when I've been up here in the past, it's usually to talk about money. You'll be happy to know that that's not the topic of today's sermon. Today, my topic is one that's been on my heart for quite some time. It's the question, where is God? And that's a question I think a lot of us have probably asked at one time or another. Probably more than once. Sometimes we might look at it as sort of an intellectual or theological question about the location of the Lord. But commonly it comes up in the wake of some sort of disaster. Sometimes it's a natural disaster that happens with loss of life and property, fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes. Some of these are in the news right now in Australia, for example. Sometimes it's when acts of violence occur that we don't understand. Could be wars with civilian casualties or mass shootings in workplaces, stores, nightclubs, schools, and even churches. And now we have mass stabbings that occur. Or terrorist attacks, something that many of us are worried about right about now. Events like these, often have us wonder why these terrible things happen to innocent people and can lead us to ask the question, where is God when all this happens? Now, sometimes the question comes up in things that are more personal in nature. Sometimes things that are unjust, that happen right in front of us. My family and I had an experience with this recently on Thanksgiving. We had visited my aunt's home and relatives and friends there, had a wonderful evening of good food and fellowship. Got in the car to come back to New York, and when we hit the highway, the car wasn't speeding up as it should, and it just stopped. Luckily, my cousin and his girlfriend were still nearby. We weren't far from the house we just left. They came by, they stayed with us, they helped us get the car towed somewhere where it could be repaired eventually, and stayed with us for several hours, just being with us and making sure we were okay. But because it took a while to get a car towed on Thanksgiving, the busiest auto travel day of the year, we ended up at Penn Station in Newark a little bit after 3 a.m. And I don't know if you've been to the train station at 3 a.m. It's a little different place than it is during the day. And what we saw when we were there were sort of the many faces of homelessness. There in the station, on the PATH train on the way back, and on the subway on the way back to our home. We saw the homeless people who had all of their worldly possessions in bags surrounding them. We saw the mentally ill homeless people with hygiene challenges. We got on the train, we saw many of these people. We also saw some clean, well-dressed men sitting up asleep, who you might just think that they were, traveling that day and just a little tired, but they had backpacks that were just a little bit too big and a little bit too full. They were sleeping sitting up, though, because if you're lying down on a train, you're not supposed to do that, so that might invite some police attention that you might not want. But sitting up, you might just look like you just are dozing off on the way. But we got to the end stop on the PATH train, and those people were still there. There were more homeless people on the train than people who weren't homeless. So despite the fact I'd been through this difficult evening, I was thinking about my blessings because I'd just come from a wonderful dinner and was on my way home, albeit late, and these were people who didn't have anywhere to go. And to admit it, I wondered where God was in that. And then sometimes it gets even more personal than that. Sometimes the things that are going wrong are actually in our lives. They're losses, loss of a loved one, a job, a relationship, financial stresses, other personal stresses, serious illness. Maybe it's a blessing that we thought was coming that didn't come. Maybe it's a situation that didn't go the way we wanted it to go or the way we needed it to go. Maybe it's a prayer that seemed to go unanswered, or for us, we got the wrong answer. All of these things and many more, things that happen to us in our lives, can lead us to feel very alone and to ask the question, where is God? Luckily, as Christians, for difficult questions, we can seek answers in Scripture. And so I'd like to explore this question of where God is in the scripture that we read this morning. We're going to look at the book of Acts in chapter 17, starting verse 16, with Paul's visit to Athens. You can follow along in your own Bibles, whether digital or analog. And we've got analog Bibles in the pews in front of you upstairs, should be next to you. So I invite you to follow along with me. While you find the text, let me give you a little bit of background about what we're talking about. See, Athens in the ancient world was a famous city, famous as a place for education, culture, and philosophy. Many of the ancient philosophers were from Athens or they taught there. It was a home of many great institutions of learning for hundreds of years. It was this amazing place. Now, although at the time Paul went there, the city was considered to be in decline, it still had this great reputation as a famous city known for its great thinkers, writers, artists, an intellectual and cultural center for the world. Sound like anywhere we know? Sometimes the ancient world's not that much different than the modern world. So let's go to the Bible, Acts 17, starting at verse 16. Now, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Now, they refer here to Athens as a city full of idols. And actually, some of the ancient writers estimate that there were over 30,000 idols in Athens. Whether it's temples or statues or whatever, 30,000 idols. In fact, at the time, one of the other things Athens was known for is a place with more idols than people, because the population was only about 20,000. And of course, that 30,000 was just the physical idols, the idols made by human hands. We know, of course, that there are other kinds of idols, things that we end up focusing our attention on. You know, anything that you focus a lot of your mind and attention on might be an idol. And both of these kinds of idols can get in the way, can get between us and God. In fact, sometimes when we're wondering where God is, sometimes that's because there's an idol in the way, diverting our attention and distracting us from seeing him. So we need to think about whether or not we have idols like that in our lives. Athens was also a city where discussion about important topics happened in different places. Now, when Paul was traveling around the world, delivering the good news, he'd go to a new city, and he usually would, at that place, go to the synagogue. He'd go to the church if there was one there, but he'd go to the synagogue to talk and preach. And he did the same thing in Athens, but he also went to the marketplace. The marketplace in Athens was a little different. It wasn't just a place of commerce, a place to buy and sell things. It was also famous as a place where philosophers would speak to the crowds, where people would go to talk about politics and the events of the day. In fact, it's sort of, if you think about it, it's sort of like a physical place, and it's kind of the equivalent of today's social media. You know, a place where people can talk and be heard and share ideas and thoughts. So it was a natural place for Paul to go to speak, and people spoke back. In fact, the passage we just read refers to the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers as groups that debated with him. And of course, we're all familiar with the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. No? I think we are. Let me tell you a little bit about that, because one of the things about Scripture is that when there are things that are referred to specifically in Scripture, there's usually a reason for that. These two groups of philosophers actually had particular approaches to life that put them in opposition to what Paul's message was in two areas in terms of those philosophies and what they thought caused fulfillment in life and how they looked at God. The Epicureans thought fulfillment in life was achieved through the pursuit of pleasure. Okay? So you wanted to avoid displeasure, fear, and anxiety, but the pursuit of pleasure was the key. Does that sound familiar? Okay. We live in many ways in a society that's Epicurean, okay, where the pursuit of pleasure is a major focus of the attention of the society. The Epicureans also basically thought that the gods were not concerned with people and what they did. This is kind of a convenient concept to have. If your focus is a pursuit of pleasure, it's kind of a good idea to have gods that really don't care about what you're doing. So, they believed in an irrelevant, impersonal God. Stoics were a little different. They thought fulfillment was found in just accepting the course of events, including pain and suffering. They're just part of nature. They're controlled by fate. They're just the way that they are. And their concept of God was that God was nature and the universe. Okay. Again, relevant, but impersonal, not really having an impact in terms of someone that you could reach. Reminds me in a way of the idea that bad things are just God's will and we just need to accept them. That sounded to me like a Stoic philosophy. So these groups of philosophers were debating with Paul in the marketplace, and I'm sure those debates got intense and they got kind of heated because they had very different ideas of what fulfillment was and what God was. In fact, he got some insults. They called him a babbler. And they accused him of advocating foreign gods. Now, that's a little bit more than an intellectual concept there, this thing about advocating foreign gods, because it was actually criminal to advocate foreign gods in Athens, even though they had 30,000 idols. In fact, 450 years earlier, this philosopher Socrates was convicted of advocating foreign gods and sentenced to death. So debating can be dangerous. But Paul had a focus, and so he continued what he was trying to do. Enough people were interested in and concerned about what Paul had to say that they invited him to speak some more. So if we go back to our Bibles to verse 19 of the same chapter, it says here, "Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, 'May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean.' All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas." Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing that you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you." Now, the term at the beginning of this section, "they took him," was not just an invitation. Okay. In fact, the original translation of those words indicate that this was a little bit more of a command than an invitation. So if they're commanding him to come to speak, there's a little bit of danger involved in that. It might have been that they were looking to get some evidence that he really was advocating foreign gods and send him down Socrates' road. Okay. But it was also an opportunity for Paul to spread the gospel, and although in many cases there was danger involved, it was still something that needed to be done. So they invited him to the Areopagus, and the Areopagus was this hill in Athens. It was a place where the city council there met, usually in private meetings to discuss things that were going on with the city. But unlike a council meeting, they invited the public to this particular meeting where Paul was going to speak. In fact, Paul and his ideas in the marketplaces and the synagogues had become kind of trendy. People were interested in showing up, and you had all these Athenians and foreigners who just loved to talk and listen to ideas. So they were going to hear what this new idea was about. Okay. So Paul goes there and he speaks. He starts off by saying that to the people of Athens, that that you are very religious, probably because of all the idols everywhere in the city. But he uses this as a way to speak about Jesus in the context of the city as it is, and refers to this altar with this inscription, "To an unknown God," and uses it as a way to make God known. He uses it to proclaim the gospel to them, and he tells them they're ignorant of the very thing that they worship. And so he explains it to them. And this gets us to my favorite part of the scripture here. So if we go to Acts 17, verse 24, God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. So Paul's proclamation here to the Athenians, it's not just a message to them, but it's a message for all of us. And it's an answer to the question, where is God? It's the truth about God and where he is, the God who made the world and everything in it. A God who doesn't live in temples made by human hands. You see, God's not limited by being in the temples in Athens or anywhere else. He's not limited to being reached by idols or the worship of idols. It doesn't matter that there's 30,000 of them. It doesn't matter that there's more idols than people. And it doesn't matter that there are intangible idols in our lives that might get in the way of our ability to see him. He's a God that's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. He's not limited by Epicurean or Stoic or any other philosophies that direct us away from him. It doesn't require anyone to serve as an intermediary, as a way for him to reach us or for us to reach him. He's a God that gives everyone life and breath and everything else. Our lives and everything that we have come from him and are gifts from him. It says that everything that has been and is and will be comes from God. And there's a reason for all of that. God did all of this. He created us and everything around us, not just because he could, not just to show us his divinity and power, but it says here that he did it so that we would seek him. He did it so that we would perhaps reach out for him and find him. But he's not far from any one of us. You see, we don't need to wonder where God is. He's right here with us. And we're here so that we would seek him. We're here so that we would perhaps reach out for him and find him. He's not so far away that we can't do that. But we have to choose to do it. See, the answer to the question about where is God isn't just a geographic sort of question, as if we have to go on a pilgrimage somewhere to find him. It's not a philosophical question, as if there's some intellectual series of steps, some particular school of philosophy that we need to follow or take to reach him. It's not a question that's limited in any way. It's not even limited by us. It's not limited by our desires, not limited by our thoughts, not limited by what happens to us and around us in life. But it is a question that requires some action from us. So whether it's a natural disaster or calamity, acts of violence, a problem that we see others experience in front of us, something not good happening in our personal lives, or anything else leading us to ask where God is, the answer is not far away. God is right here with us. But there's something we need to do. We need to seek him and reach out for him. And church, if we do that, He can give us love at times when love seems rare and far away. He can give us peace in the midst of strife, fear, and anxiety. He can give us answers when all we seem to have are questions. But we can't just wait for him to show up and despair when he doesn't. He's already here. But we need to turn to him, and he'll be there for us. So, as the worship team comes forward, we're going to move into communion. You know, if you continue the reading that we just mentioned, Paul talks more. He talks about how God has given proof of what he said by raising Jesus from the dead. And, you know, some sneered at the idea, but it says that some believed and became followers of Paul and followers of Christ. So we celebrate communion to commemorate the death of Jesus and the new covenant. We do it through sharing the bread that represents his body broken for us. We do it with the juice that represents his blood shed for us, and we remember his sacrifice and what it means for us. So, if you're a believer who's given your life to Christ, we invite you to participate in this sacrament. We've got 2 stations here in the front, 2 in the back on the stairs. We ask you to come forward in groups of 4 to 6 because we want to take communion together as a family. Now, if you haven't accepted Christ yet, we ask that you spend this time in silent reflection, perhaps considering where God is in your life and how you can turn to him.